Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abralim ao Vivo series. Abralim ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. I am Miguel Oliveira, president of Abralim. Today, I'd like to introduce Dirk Pijpops, who is currently a lecturer of Dutch at the University of Liège. His research is centered on the study of language variation and change with usage-based construction grammar as a theoretical background. The title of his lecture today is Parsimony in Usage-Based Argument Structure. Before we start, I'd like to thank you, Dirk Pijpops, for accepting Abralim's invitation and to say that questions and comments are very welcome in the chat. Please join me and welcome Dirk Pijpops.
All right, thank you, Miguel, and thank you to all the people of Abralim for organizing this great series of talks, which I am proud to be a part of. So, let me just share my screen. All right, so parsimony in usage-based argument structure. Now, you may notice, or you may not, but usage-based linguists don't like parsimony. If you use the word in a paper, they'll probably scrap the word from it. If you bring it up in a discussion, either in an academic context or just in a bar with a couple of usage-based friends, they'll probably all turn on you. And they have good reasons for this. They have good reasons not to like parsimony. You see, within linguistics, the word parsimony has mostly been used to refer to what you could call parsimony of grammatical description. And that's the idea that if you have a language and you have several potential grammars for that language, so several grammars that are all compatible with that language, that all do a good job at describing that language, you should go for the grammar that has the fewest and the most general grammatical rules. So basically, the shortest, most general grammar of a language is to be preferred. And usage-based linguists have forcibly argued against this with good reason. Language users don't always make the broadest possible generalizations about their language. In fact, they're much more likely to work with small local generalizations, often tied to specific lexemes, rather than with abstract grammatical rules. However, this is not actually what parsimony means, or at least it's not how parsimony is used outside of linguistics in other scientific fields. Outside of linguistics, it's usually used as something that you could call parsimony of theoretical explanation. And that's the idea that if you have a number of empirical observations and you have several theoretical explanations for them, several theoretical explanations that can all account for these observations, then you should go for the one that requires the fewest theoretical assumptions. So basically, this is just an application of Occam's razor. And this is something that usage-based linguistics is actually very good at. For instance, usage-based linguistics can explain how children acquire language without needing to assume the existence of an innate language acquisition device. Or, for instance, usage-based linguistics can explain how language users process language cognitively without needing to assume the existence of any domain-specific cognitive mechanisms. So without needing to refer to any cognitive mechanisms that are specific to language. Or, for instance, usage-based linguistics can explain how language evolved in the human species without needing to assume that it suddenly happened because of a single genetic mutation that enabled us to use language, which is a highly problematic assumption from a biological point of view. So usage-based linguistics is actually very good in parsimony. And this is actually the reason why I got into usage-based linguistics, why I was attracted to the theoretical framework, because it could explain so much with so little, with assuming so little. All right, so for this talk, we'll be looking at argument structure. So a usage-based approach to argument structure. Now, argument structure is a fairly classical field of study within linguistics, right? It looks at the verb. We'll be looking at verbal argument structure, so the verb and its complements. Now, it's also a field of study where there is quite a lot of language variation. And here you see some examples from different languages. So for instance, for English, you can say both Sam chipped at the rock or Sam chipped the rock. Or of course, you have the famous dative alternation, as in their sultan sent an ultimatum to us versus their sultan sent us an ultimatum. Or you have the locative alternation, as in he loaded hay onto the cart versus he loaded the cart with hay, etc. And you also find this variation in, say, Italian. You see some examples here. Or Dutch, and you also see some examples here and in a bunch of other languages. So the challenge here basically is that we find that these variants, these argument structure variants, they seem to kind of mean the same thing, but not completely. So there are always subtle meaning differences between the variants. And our challenge is then, of course, how can we explain these meaning differences? How can we account for these meaning differences, preferably in a parsimonious way? All right. So this will be the structure of the rest of my talk. So first, I'll present this challenge in detail. So the challenge that I just talked about, how to explain these subtle meaning differences in argument structure. Then I'll introduce the case study that we'll be looking at. And from there on, the structure is fairly straightforward, right? So hypotheses, testing these hypotheses, and then revisiting the original challenge. All right, so let's start with presenting the challenge in detail. So like I said, argument structure is a fairly classical field of study within linguistics, and it's also been studied extensively by early usage-based linguists. There are several theoretical works on argument structure. For instance, there's the famous paper by Hopper and Thompson on transitivity. There's also a highly influential paper by Doughty, who proposed that we should distinguish between a proto-agent and a proto-patient, which each had a number of properties. And with this distinction, we could then account for the variation in, say, argument structure with the psych verbs, with the locative alternation, and so on and so forth. Langecker has also worked on argument structure. And of course, there's the famous book by Goldberg, which kickstarted construction grammar. So Goldberg, 1995, who proposed that we should distinguish between several highly schematic argument structure constructions, such as the conative construction, the ditransitive construction, or the caused-motion construction. All of these would be in English. And each of these constructions would be associated with their own meaning, and these meanings would then be able to account for the specific meaning distinctions that we find. All right. Now, what all of these accounts have in common is that they refer to fairly high-level semantic notions, right? So notions such as volitionality, agency, affectedness, directionality, sentience, movement, etc. And they also have in common that they try to explain as much as possible using one or a few of these notions. And that's a good thing, right? That's something that you should do, try to explain as much as possible. However, the problem was a bit that it didn't really work, or at least there were cases where it didn't really work. For instance, let's look at the English at alternation, as in Sam chipped at the rock versus Sam chipped the rock. So let's take Goldberg's proposal from 1995 as an example. So of course, this is dated and this has been updated since then, but this is just to be used as an illustration, right? So let's take Goldberg's proposal as a starting point. She proposed that the at construction would mean something like direct action at, while the transitive construction would mean something like act on. So now we can use these meanings to predict the meaning distinction that would be at work in this particular example, right? So for instance, for the sentence with at, we take the at construction, We take all other constructions that are present in that sentence, such as the lexical chip construction, which means break off a small fragment, the past tense construction, which means that it happened in the past tense, etc. And then we arrive at the meaning for the sentence. Sam directed action at a rock and broke off a small fragment from it. If we do the same for the transitive sentence, we get something like Sam acted on the rock and broke off a small fragment from it. But that sounds quite intuitive, right, as a meaning distinction. But that's not actually the meaning distinction that we find here. As argued, for instance, by Cristiano Brokias and Florent Perek, the meaning distinction here is a lot more concrete, a lot more tangible. And rather, the at variant means something like Sam repeatedly or in a bit-by-bit fashion broke off a small fragment from the rock. So that's a lot more concrete, right? Now you might say, all right, no problem. That just means that we need to make the meaning of the at construction more concrete, and replace its meaning of direct action at by repeatedly or in a bit-by-bit fashion do something. All right, so let's move on to another example. Say I slapped at a mosquito versus I slapped a mosquito. And let's do the same thing, right? Let's try to predict the meaning distinction based on this new meaning of the at construction. So then we end up with the meaning, I repeatedly or in a bit-by-bit fashion struck a mosquito so sharply. Assuming that slap means something like strike sharply and the past tense construction means that it happened in the past tense, etc. If we do the same thing for the transitive variant, we end up with I acted on and struck a mosquito sharply. However, again, that's not the meaning distinction that's expressed here, as for instance argued by the same authors. Rather, the meaning distinction is I tried to strike a mosquito sharply, but didn't necessarily succeed. Versus I just struck a mosquito sharply. I did succeed in striking it. All right, so basically this meaning of direct action at is too vague to account for the various specific meaning distinctions found in the at-alternation. For instance, repeatedly or in a bit-by-bit fashion does not necessarily succeed, and etc. So this means that we have to say that, either we say that the at construction is polysemous, and sometimes it means this, sometimes it means that, and whatever it means seems to depend upon the verb, or at least the context. Or we have to say that there are all different at constructions and each has their own meaning. One meaning would be repeatedly, one meaning would be does not necessarily succeed, etc. All right, so let's look at another example, an example from Italian. So this is an argument structure variation, piece of argument structure variation that's discussed by Alessandro Lenci. So l'Assemblea ha deciso l'acquisto della società versus l'Assemblea ha deciso sull'acquisto della società. So to any Italians watching, I'm really sorry, I probably totally butchered that pronunciation, but yeah. So Alessandro Lenci described the meaning distinction here, or found that the meaning distinction was something like the assembly directly decided to buy the company versus the assembly is still deciding on whether to buy the company. Or let's look at another argument structure alternation in Italian. Gianni ha rimproverato suo padre per questo versus Gianni ha rimproverato questo a suo padre. Again, sorry for the pronunciation. Now here, Alessandro Lenci finds that the meaning distinction is John reproached his father for this, with his father being immediately present, versus John reproached his father for this, with his father not being present. And then he has these two very nice quotes about this variation. Something like direct involvement seems to be at stake here, and this might suggest that affectedness is again the crucial semantic factor. However, this interpretation would require us to stretch the meaning of affectedness well beyond its standard, fairly high vagueness and polysemy, thereby impairing its reliability as a truly explanatory notion in semantics. Or a bit more short, the type of semantic contrast can hardly be explained in terms of general categories. So basically, what we have here is that corpus researchers, or just empirical linguists in general, often find very specific meaning distinctions between particular argument structure constructions. But these meaning distinctions are often specific to particular lexemes, for instance, specific to particular verbs, and they are so concrete and linked to the verb that they are very difficult or even impossible to predict solely based on high-level semantic notions. And you have the same thing being argued for the dative alternation by, for instance, William Croft, Hans Boas, and Melanie Reutlesberger, who argues that there seem to be several subtle meaning distinctions at play for the dative alternation, but these are often specific to particular verbs or particular verb classes, and hence difficult to account for. And because of that, Eva Draboska actually criticizes the use of such high-level semantic notions, such as agency, affectedness, and etc., because they are so vague, and because they are necessarily so vague, right? Because they try to account for so many different things that they basically become unfalsifiable. They become actually useless to predict concrete meaning distinctions. But then, I mean, what's the alternative here? What should we then do? Should we just posit all of these meaning distinctions for all of these specific argument structure alternations without being able to explain them, without being able to predict them based on a general theoretical mechanism? I mean, that's just giving up, right? That's not a very attractive proposition either. So you could say we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Or you could say we're stuck between Charybdis and Scylla. So Charybdis and Scylla are two monsters from Greek mythology that each sat on one end of the Strait of Sicily, and any ship that needed to pass through the strait would need to avoid both monsters, right? And that would be very hard, because if you try to avoid Scylla, you usually get eaten by Charybdis, and if you try to avoid Charybdis, you usually get eaten by Scylla. So on the one hand, basically, we have these very nice, very parsimonious accounts of argument structure, theoretical accounts of argument structure, which are, however, not that useful for actually predicting the concrete meaning distinctions that we find. So on the one hand, we have Charybdis with the problem of prediction, the fact that we can't really use them to predict. And on the other hand, we could say, all right, let's just posit all of these concrete meaning distinctions. But then what's the explanation for them, right? Then we lose parsimony. We lose the way of explaining them in a parsimonious way. All right, so that's our challenge, basically. How do we hypothesize meaning distinctions that are specific enough to yield clearly falsifiable and successful predictions regarding language variation, while at the same time also only relying on general theoretical mechanisms? Now, what I would like to argue today is that one possible solution for this challenge, one way of avoiding both Scylla and Charybdis, is by incorporating the multi-level nature of the constructicon into hypothesis testing. By systematically formulating and testing hypotheses at various levels of schematicity in the constructional network. All right, so what do I mean by that? What does this mean to incorporate the multi-level nature of the constructicon into hypothesis testing? Well, for that, I'll first introduce our case study of today. So a case study is a piece of argument structure variation in Dutch, and it's the alternation between transitive construction and the so-called naar construction, naar being a preposition meaning to. And here you see a couple of examples of that alternation. So for instance, duikers zoeken nu nog mogelijke slachtoffers versus duikers zoeken nu nog naar mogelijke slachtoffers. Or Dirk de Wilde verlangt wat meer creativiteit versus Dirk de Wilde verlangt naar wat meer creativiteit. So each time a variant of the transitive construction and a variant of with naar, preposition naar. All right, so what does it mean to investigate this variation at various levels of schematicity? So for that, we first need to determine what these various levels are, right? So we need to sketch out a potential constructional network for the naar construction. And to do that, we can just start at the bottom. So at the bottom of the constructional network, at the bottom of the constructicon, you find the individual constructs, which are just the fully instantiated constructions or fully ready-made sentences, basically. So these are sentences such as, Dirk de Wilde verlangt naar wat meer creativiteit, Dirkers zoeken nu nog naar mogelijke slachtoffers, and so on. Now from there, we can already distinguish a first level of schematicity, so a slightly more schematic level, just by distinguishing between a verb slot, a preposition slot, a subject slot, and an object slot, right? So we'll call that the micro level. And then we can distinguish a further level by opening up one of those slots. So now we need to decide which of these 4 slots we need to open up. Now we prefer to stay away from the preposition slot because the preposition is often used in theoretical accounts of argument structure to distinguish between several highly schematic constructions, such as the English at construction, which I already talked about, or the English into construction, etc. So hands off the preposition. We also prefer not to open up the verb slot because, again, of the pivotal role of the verb in theoretical accounts of argument structure. So that leaves the subject slot and the object slot, of which we also prefer to keep the object slot fixed because objects seem to better lend themselves to constructionalization than subjects. So by that I mean that there are a lot more idioms with an open subject slot and a fixed object slot than the other way around. So in English, for instance, you have kick the bucket, spill the beans, bite the bullet. In Dutch, you have varkentje wassen, zijn schub afkeuzen, een oogje dichtknijpen, and so on. So each time, open subject slot, fixed verb slot, and fixed object slot. All right, so we open up the subject slot to distinguish a further level of schematicity, slightly more schematic. Then we can open up the object slot. Then we can open up the verb slot. And finally, we could also open up the preposition slot, but let's just stop for now. All right, so here you now see a potential constructional network of the naar construction, ranging from completely instantiated constructs to highly schematic constructions. So if you're familiar with construction grammar, you're also familiar with these kinds of networks, right? You see them in basically any handbook on construction grammar. All right, now what do I mean by, you now see these nicely defined levels here. You could, of course, go even more fine-grained and distinguish further levels here, for instance, between the preposition-specific level and the verb-specific level. You could also distinguish a level of verb clause-specific constructions, or between the verb-specific level and the theme-specific level, you could distinguish a level of theme clause-specific constructions. By theme, by the way, I simply mean the participant that appears in the object slot. So you could distinguish further intermediate levels, but I think these are already crucial milestones in the continuum, because it is a continuum from instantiated constructs to completely schematic constructions. All right, now what does it mean to investigate an alternation at various levels of abstractions, at the various levels that you see here? Well, for one, we could investigate the alternation at the preposition specific level. And this is what's usually done. That means that we study the alternation as a choice between the naar construction and the transitive construction, which then occurs with a bunch of different verbs. However, we can also decide to investigate the alternation at the verb-specific level. In that case, we'd have to study the choice between, for instance, the verlang naar construction and the transitive verlang construction. And that would be one alternation. And then separate from that, we'd also investigate the choice between the zoek naar construction and the transitive zoek construction, meaning search. And separate from that, we'd investigate the choice between the peil naar construction and the transitive peil construction, and so on. So because all of these choices would be different alternations, would be separate choices, we would expect one choice to be driven by completely different motivating factors than another, right? But we could also take this further and investigate the alternation at the theme-specific level. In that case, we would investigate the choice between the zoek naar slachtoffer construction and the transitive zoek slachtoffer construction, as well as separate from that, the choice between the zoek naar woord construction and the transitive zoek woord construction. And separate from that, the choice between the zoek naar creativiteit construction and the zoek creativiteit construction, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's what I mean by investigating an alternation at various levels of abstraction, right? And those levels are what you see here. All right, so now time to formulate some hypotheses. Now, all hypotheses that will be formulated during this talk are based on the theoretical mechanism that's called the lexical origin mechanism. The lexical origin mechanism was first proposed by Goldberg in 1999. And the idea is basically that schematic constructions obtain their meaning from their most prototypical lexical slot fillers. So let me explain how that works using the English dative alternation. So the idea is basically as follows. First, there is some pressure in language users, some pressure in language usage that is not related to semantics. For instance, say, let's assume that the verb give often occurs with short recipients, such as you, me, him, her, etc. Now, because of language processing, just the way that people process language, this would create ostensible lexical biases. This would mean that give often occurs in the ditransitive construction. However, this would not be because give itself prefers to occur in the ditransitive construction, but simply because it often occurs with short recipients, right? So that's why I call it an ostensible lexical bias. Now, once this is the case, once give very often occurs in the ditransitive construction, language users will start to associate the ditransitive construction with the meaning of give, which is basically change of possession, right? So at that point, the schematic ditransitive construction has acquired a meaning. And how can we then see that? How can we see that it has acquired a meaning? Well, first of all, other verbs that are also compatible with this meaning change of possession will also start to prefer the ditransitive construction, because constructions that are compatible in meaning tend to occur together. Sorry. So these would be verbs such as offer, grant, award, etc., right? Also verbs that entail a change of possession. So basically now we get real meaning-driven lexical biases. So these verbs prefer the ditransitive construction because of their meaning and not because of some other something else in their context. And secondly, we would also start to see this meaning distinction within a single verb. So for instance, if we would look at all occurrences of the verb send, and we would distinguish between those occurrences where a change of possession is implied and those occurrences where a change of possession is not implied, then we expect to see that the ditransitive construction is much more popular among those instances where the change of possession is implied. So for instance, instances such as my fiance sent me my birthday present would more likely have the ditransitive construction, whereas instances such as he sent an emissary to me, where there's no change of possession, would less likely appear in ditransitive construction. All right, so that's basically the idea behind the lexical origin mechanism. So let's write this down. Let's write down how we can use the lexical origin mechanism to make predictions in a new case study. So step one, first thing we would have to do would be to identify the most prototypical lexical fillers of both constructions, right? Of both alternating constructions. Step 2 would then be to use these most prototypical fillers to estimate the meaning of both constructions. Step 3 would then be to test these hypothesized meanings by making the following predictions. First of all, lexical fillers that are more coherent with the meaning of a construction will more likely appear in that construction. So for instance, verbs such as offer, award, etc., that are coherent with the meaning change of possession will more likely appear in the ditransitive construction. And secondly, among the instances of a single lexical filler, among the instances of a single verb, such as send, the instances that are more inclined towards the meaning of a construction will more likely appear in that construction. All right. Now notice two things here. First of all, none of these steps actually specifies a particular level of schematicity. So we can apply all of these steps to basically any level in the constructional network where there are constructions that have open slots. Because we do need open slots, right? We need to identify the most prototypical fillers in a slot of the construction. And secondly, these are just a number of steps that you need to go to, right? So this is basically an algorithm. Actually, this is a for loop. If you're familiar with any programming language, basically Python or R or Lisp or whatever, you can clearly see, that this is a for loop, right? This just says for every level in the constructional network, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. All right. So let's do that. Let's apply this algorithm to various levels in the constructional network. So here we have our constructional network again, or at least our potential constructional network. Like I said, we do need open constructional slots. So the two final levels, the micro level and the level of the individual constructs, can't be used. So the mechanism can be applied to those, but we can apply it to those other levels. And let's start at the top. Let's start at preposition specific level. All right, so let's apply the lexical origin algorithm at the preposition specific level. So this means we'll be investigating the choice between the naar construction and the transitive construction, right? So step 1 was to identify the most prototypical lexical fillers of both constructions. Now, the algorithm doesn't actually specify of which slot to identify the most prototypical lexical fillers. But because this current level, the preposition specific level, was created by opening up the verb slot, we'll go for the verb slot. So we run constructional analyses on the verb slot of the naar construction and the transitive construction. And for that, we made use of the syntactically parsed sonar corpus of written Dutch. All right, so these are the results. So on the left side, you see the most prototypical fillers of the verb slot of the naar construction. So go, look, travel, refer, and come. And on the right side, you see the most prototypical fillers of the verb slot of the transitive construction. Have, get, do, see, and take. All right, so step 2 was to use these prototypical fillers to estimate the meaning of both constructions. The lexical origin mechanism states that the meaning of the naar construction and meaning of the transitive construction is likely to be derived from these verbs. So one way to interpret this basically is to say that the naar construction seems to express some kind of directionality, right? All these verbs, go, look, travel, refer, come, seem to have a meaning element of directionality in common. Meanwhile, for the transitive construction, I don't really see any meaning element that these verbs have in common. So perhaps you can just say, all right, the naar construction expresses directionality, the transitive construction does not, right? All right, so third step was then, we now have an hypothesized meaning distinction. You can test this meaning distinction in two ways. First, lexical fillers that are more coherent with the meaning of a construction will more likely appear in that construction. So now we need a way of measuring meaning, of operationalizing, of quantifying meaning. How do we do that? Well, the most common methodological technique to measure meaning is to use distributional vectors, right? So what we did is we calculated distributional vectors for each of the alternating verbs, as well as for each of the top 5 lexemes. And then for each alternating verb, we calculated a measure called verb directionality. Now this measure is higher the closer the vector of a verb is in distributional vector space to the top 5 lexemes of the naar construction. So basically, the closer a verb's meaning is to go, look, travel, refer, and come, the higher this measure of verb directionality. And also, the farther its vector is away from have, get, do, and see, the higher this measure of verb directionality. So basically, we could say, all right, let's predict that the measure verb directionality will have a positive effect on the use of the prepositional variant among the instances of the alternating verbs. Now, what this means in practice is that, sorry. Now, what this means in practice is that the verb zoeken, for instance, would be predicted to appear more often in the prepositional variant than verbs such as verlangen, desire, or peilen, gauge. Why? Because this verb is closer in meaning to go, look, travel, refer, and come. That's intuitive, right? Zoeken, search, really means, well, going somewhere, looking for something, whereas these other two verbs, desire and gauge, seem to have less of a directional element in them. All right, that was the first prediction. Second prediction, among the meaning of a single lexical filler, the instances that are more inclined towards the meaning of a construction will more likely appear in that construction. So basically, among the instances of a single verb, the instances that express more of a directional movement will more likely appear in the prepositional variant. All right, so that already gives us our first hypothesis, and this hypothesis has two predictions associated with it. Now let's go on and apply the lexical origin algorithm to the verb specific level. So now we're at this level, right? The verb specific level with constructions such as the verlangen naar construction and the zoek naar construction. So let's start with verlangen, desire. So at this point, we're investigating the alternation between the verlangen naar construction and the transitive verlang construction. So first step, identify the most prototypical lexical fillers of both constructions. Now, at this point, we can no longer look at the verb slot because the verb slot is fixed, but we can still look at the other open slots. So this time we'll look at the object slot because the current level was created by opening up the object slot, right? So we ran constructional analysis on the object slot of the verlang naar construction and the transitive verlang construction. And these are the results. All right, so the second step was to use these most prototypical fillers to estimate the meaning of the constructions. So as the most prototypical fillers of the object slot of the verlang naar construction, we find objects such as child, life, rest, death, home. So perhaps you could say these are more like things that you long for, right? You long for a child, you long for life, you long for rest, you may long for death, and you long for home. Whereas for the transitive verlang construction, we find proof, counter effort, contribution, sacrifice, and guarantee. So these are more like things that you demand, right? So in that way, we can interpret these results to say that the verlangen naar construction expresses a longing, whereas the transitive verlang construction expresses a demand. All right, third step, how do we test this distinction? Well, we make the first prediction. The first prediction states that lexical fillers that are more coherent with the meaning of construction will more likely appear in that construction. So basically, themes that are more coherent with the meaning of one construction will more likely appear in that construction. So again, we calculated distributional vectors for all of the themes. And then for each theme, we calculated a measure which we called theme wrongfulness, which is basically, well, this measure is higher the closer a theme is in meaning to child, life, rest, death, and home. And this measure is lower the closer a team is in meaning to proof, counter effort, contribution, sacrifice, and guarantee. So basically the idea is that the more a team is like something that you long for, the higher this measure, the more a team is like something that you demand, the lower this measure. So this measure would then be predicted to have a positive effect on the use of the prepositional variant among the instances of verlangen, right? All right, then the second prediction, among the instances of a single team, the instances that express more of a longing will more often appear in the verlang naar construction. All right, so that gives us our second prediction with, again, or second hypothesis, I mean, with again 2 predictions. Then we'll look at the verb zoeken, search, so again at the verb specific level. So now we're studying the choice between the prepositional zoek naar construction and the transitive zoek construction. And we just apply the same algorithm. So first we identify the most prototypical lexical fillers of both constructions. We'll again look at the object slot. And here are the results. Second step, let's use these most prototypical lexical fillers to estimate the meaning of both constructions. So what you could perhaps say is that manner, alternative, survivor, and cause, the most prototypical fillers of the zoek naar construction are all things that you literally look for, right? That exist independently of the act of searching and that you're literally searching for. Meanwhile, things such as refuge, contact, salvation, and rapprochement, these are more like things that you that only come into being when you find them, right? So when you're looking for contact, when you're looking for salvation, rapprochement, or refuge, these things only exist the moment that the search has ended, the moment that you find them. And you could say that the topical lexeme solution, which is topical lexeme for both constructions, can kind of be compatible with both interpretations, right? You can both say, all right, the solution only comes into being the moment that we find it, or you could say, yeah, actually the solution already exists, but we just need to find it. We just need to figure it out. All right, so in that way, we can interpret these results as indicating a distinction whereby the zoek naar construction expresses a literal looking for, whereas the transitive zoek construction expresses more of an attempt to make or to acquire. All right, so then we make the first predictions. Again, we calculated a measure which we call team searchability, which is higher the closer a team is in meaning to the top 5 lexemes of the zoek naar construction, and lower a team is in meaning to the top 5 lexemes of the transitive zoek construction. This measure would then be predicted to have a positive effect on the use of the prepositional variant, but only among the instances of zoeken. And then the second prediction is among the instances of a single lexical filler, among the instances of a single team, the instances that express more of a literal looking for will more likely appear in the zoek naar construction. All right, so that gives us our final hypothesis, our third hypothesis. And again, 2 predictions, right? Now that we're looking at specific verbs anyway, we're looking at verlangen and zoeken. We can focus on the second prediction of the directionality hypothesis. So we can say, all right, among the instances of a specific verb, the instances that express more of directional movement will more likely appear in the prepositional variant. What does this mean? Well, we can say, all right, let's test this among the instances of verlangen and among the instances of zoeken. So how can we operationalize that? How can we distinguish between those instances? Excuse me. Those instances that those instances that express more of directional movement and those instances that don't. Well, for this, we also ran a constructional analysis on the object slot of the naar construction and the transitive construction. And here you see the results. So for the NAV construction, we find top collections such as home, school, place, bed, and hospital. So all things that you, all locations, basically places that you go to. Whereas for the transitive construction, yeah, we find chance, role, money, work, and problem. So basically not places, right? So not locations that you go to. So what we did is we said, all right, let's calculate for each filler of the object thought for each theme, a measure which we call theme directionality, which is higher the closer theme is to these locations, to home, school, place, bed, and hospital, and lower sorry, I'm having a bit of throat issues. Which is lower, the closer a theme is to chance, role, money, work, and problem. All right. So what does this mean in practice? Well, this means in practice that if you're desiring to go to a place, such as sometimes I desire to go to a completely empty room that is painted right, this would be predicted to occur in the prepositional variant. Whereas if you're demanding a thing, such as the buyer of pornography does not desire a little whim of poetry, this would be predicted to occur in the transitive variant. And for the verb zoeken, you would make the same prediction, right? If you're searching for a place, this would be predicted to occur in the prepositional variant. But if you're searching for something else, a formula or another thing, this would be predicted to occur in the transitive variant. Right, so that gives us these two predictions. Now we can also look at the second predictions of the longing hypothesis and the looking for hypothesis. So these talked about a specific theme. So basically, this is about investigating the alternation at the theme specific level. And specifically, we'll look at the themes naar tijdverlangen, naar dingverlangen, naar slachtofferverlangen, en naar woordverlangen. All right. So the first prediction said, among the instances of a specific theme, for instance, among the instances of tijd, among the instances of naar tijdverlangen, desired time, the instances that express more of a longing will more likely appear in the prepositional variant, while the instances that express more of a demand will more likely appear in the transitive variant. How can we operationalize this? Well, one way of operationalizing this would be to say, all right, if you're longing for time, if you're longing for a particular time in the past or present, this will likely involve time as a count noun. Whereas if you're demanding time, for instance, demanding time to perform a certain task, that would more likely involve time as a mass noun. So let's annotate these instances for the distinction between mass and count noun. Make the same prediction for naar ding verlangen. So among the instances of naar ding verlangen, desire thing, the instances that express more of a longing will more likely appear in the prepositional variant, whereas the instances that express more of demand will more likely appear in the transitive variant. Now for ding, I could not find a way of cleverly operationalizing this distinction, so I just tried annotating it for it directly. Of course, while blinded for the choice of variant, right? So I manually annotated for this while removing all instances of naar from the data. All right, then for zoeken, say zoek naar slachtoffer and zoek slachtoffer. There the prediction was among the instances of a specific theme. So for instance, among the instances of slachtoffer, victim, the instances that express more of a literal looking for will more likely appear in the prepositional variant, while the instances that express more of a attempt to make or an attempt to acquire will more likely appear in the transitive variant. How can we operationalize this? Well, we can say, all right, attempting to make victims, that only makes sense if the agent in question is an aggressor, right? Is someone who is going to make victims, going to turn people into victims. Whereas if you're just literally looking for victims, for pre-existing victims, so to say, that's more likely when the agent is a helper, say a rescue worker trying to look for victims after an earthquake or something. So I annotated for agent type, distinction between aggressors and helpers. And then finally, we also looked at woord. So the choice between the zoek naar woord construction and the zoekwoord construction. And here we had the same prediction among the instances of woord, word. The instances that express more of a literal looking for will more likely appear in the prepositional variant, while the instances that express more of attempt to make or to acquire will more likely appear in the transitive variant. So here we said, all right, attempting to make words, that is something like attempt to express something, right? And if you're attempting to express something, you're just trying to find words for what you're trying to express, and you're not looking for specific words. So basically any word that expresses your proposition is okay. So word would be non-specific. Whereas if you're literally looking for words, for instance, you're literally looking for a number of predetermined words in a lexicon, then you're really, well, then the words are predetermined, right? So then word would be specific. So we annotated all instances of woordzoeken or naar woordzoeken for this distinction of word specificity. All right, then we finally have all of our predictions and all of our hypotheses. All right, now let's test these predictions. And let's start with the first one, the first hypothesis, the directionality hypothesis at the preposition specific level. So let's start with this one. So to test this prediction, we extracted all instances of all alternating verbs from the sonar corpus of written Dutch, subjected this data to manual checking, and we're left with little less than 100,000 instances in total. So then to test the first prediction, we just put all these data into one data set that built a mixed logistic regression model, which had these fixed effects and these random effects. And right now we're interested in the effect of verb directionality, right? So we look at the effect plot of verb directionality. What this effect plot shows is on the y-axis, the estimated probability of a prepositional variant among the instances of all alternating verbs, and on the x-axis, verb directionality. So basically, the further right a verb is on this x-axis, the more it is like go, look, refer, come, travel. And the further on the left side it is, the more it is in meaning like have, get, do, make, right? And the prediction was then that this would have a positive effect. So there would be a positive correlation. What we find is this. So definitely not a positive correlation. So prediction not confirmed. All right, don't panic. We have other predictions for this hypothesis. The first one was that among the instances of the verb verlangen, team directionality would have a positive effect on the use of the prepositional variant. So to test this prediction, we built a regression model. Another regression model, this time based only on the data of verlangen, desire, excluding the top 5 collect themes to make sure that our prediction is not circular. And we again implemented these fixed effects and these random effects. And right now we're interested in the effect of team directionality, right? So we look at its effect plot, which shows again the estimated probability of the prepositional variant, this time only among the instances of a single verb, namely verlangen, and on the right axis, team directionality. So basically, the more on the right side of this axis a team is, the more it is like a place that you can go to. And the more on the left side it is, the less it is like a place, the more it is like a thing or a concept. And what we predicted here is again a positive effect, right? And what we find is this. So it's a positive effect, but it's not significant. So again, we have to say, all right, prediction not confirmed. Then let's move on to the final prediction of the directionality hypothesis, which was the same, right? Team directionality would have a positive effect on the use of a prepositional variant. So this time we built a regression model based only on the data of a single verb, namely the verb zoeken. And now we're again interested in the effect of team directionality. So again, we look at the effect plot. Same thing, right? The more on the right side, the more a team is like a place you can go to. The more on the left side, the more a team is like a thing or a concept. And we again predicted a positive correlation here. What we find is this. So definitely not a positive effect. So prediction again, not confirmed. So basically all of our predictions based on the directionality hypothesis were not confirmed. Again, don't panic, we do have other hypotheses. So let's move on to the verb specific hypotheses. And let's start with the longing hypothesis for the verb verlangen. So this hypothesis said that the verlang naar construction expresses a longing, whereas the transitive verlang construction expresses a demand. So to test its first prediction, we had already built a regression model based on the data of verlangen. But now we look at the effect of team wrongfulness, right? That was our first operationalization. So we again looked at the effect plot, and here, the more on the right side a team is, the more it is like something that you long for. So the more it is like life, death, rest, child, etc. More on the left side, the more it is like a thing that you demand. So counter effort, contribution, guarantee, etc. So again, we had predicted a positive effect here, and that's also what we find, a very strong and clearly positive effect. Also highly significant, so prediction confirmed. Then as for our final two predictions of the longing hypothesis, these looked at specific themes. So these specifically looked at naar tijd verlangen, naar ding verlangen. Now, verlangen the verb is not that frequent, so we only have very few themes that appear in serious numbers with those both variants, which is why we selected dead and ding. Those are the only ones that are frequent enough, basically. But even those are not very frequent. So here you see the results. Here you see the results for naar tijd verlangen, desired time. As you can see, they weren't frequent enough. Sorry, they weren't frequent enough to build a regression model or just to do basically any serious inferential statistics. So I'm just showing the mosaic plot, but as you can see, our prediction is, as far as it can be confirmed, it is confirmed because we do see that if time is a count noun, it's always used in the prepositional variant, whereas when it's a mass noun, it's used more frequently, at least in the transitive variant. So first prediction, well, second prediction confirmed. Then for naar ding verlangen, we simply annotated directly for the distinction between demand and long for. Of course, a number of instances were unclear as for that distinction. And again, the numbers are extremely low, but at least they are in concord with what we expected, right? So our predictions based on the longing hypotheses are confirmed, actually. All right, then let's move on to the looking for hypothesis. So this was the hypothesis that was specific to the verb zoeken, search. So again, we had already built a regression model specifically for zoeken, but now we're interested in the effect of team searchability. Here is the effect plot of team searchability. So basically, the more on the right side of this x-axis, the more a team is like something that you literally look for, the more it is like, what were the top collab schemes again? Solution, alternative, etc. And the more on the left side it is, the more team is like something that you attempt to make or attempt to acquire. And then again, we had predicted a positive effect. And that's also what we find, a highly significant, a very strong positive effect. All right, so first prediction confirmed. And then the second and third predictions based on the looking for hypotheses. looked at specific themes. They looked at slachtoffer and woord. So we built, so we actually had enough data for slachtoffer and woord to work with regression models. We built separate regression models based on the data of naar slachtoffer zoeken with these effect plots, and we built a second, we built a separate regression model for the instances of naar woord zoeken with these fixed effects. And now we're interested in the effect of agent type and word specificity, right? So here you see the effect plots. On the left side, you see the estimated probability of the prepositional variant among the instances, so only among the instances of naar slachtoffer zoeken, search victim. Here we had predicted that a prepositional variant would be much more popular among the helpers, where the agent was a helper. That's also what we find, so prediction confirmed. And then for search word naar woord zoeken, we had predicted that the prepositional variant would be much more popular among the instances where woord was specific. And what we find is exactly the opposite effect. So prediction not confirmed. All right, so as for the looking for hypothesis, first prediction confirmed, second prediction confirmed, third prediction not confirmed. So where does this leave us for the looking for hypothesis? Well, this distinction, so this distinction between literally looking for something and attempting to make or acquire something, if we try it out with a bunch more teams, so if we open up the investigation to a bunch more teams, which is something that we can do because the verb zoeken is actually highly frequent, then we find that this distinction does make the correct distinction for most teams. So for victim, cause, explanation, truth, perpetrator, etc., it makes a correct distinction, makes a correct prediction. But for woordzoeken and vormzoeken, it does not make the correct distinction, the correct prediction. So if we concede that woordzoeken and vormzoeken developed as constructions in their own right and became associated with their own meaning, then we can say, all right, this distinction is largely confirmed. So basically we could say, all right, looking for hypothesis, mostly confirmed. All right, so where does this leave us? Where does this leave us with our original challenge? So our challenge was, how do you hypothesize semantic meaning distinctions? Oh, semantic distinctions or meaning distinctions. They are specific enough to yield clearly falsifiable and successful predictions regarding language variation while only relying on general theoretical mechanisms. So basically, we had to navigate between two monsters, right? We had to navigate between the problem of prediction, which was represented by Charybdis, and the problem of parsimony, which was represented by Scylla. So as for the problem of prediction, did we succeed in making successful predictions? Well, the directionality hypothesis definitely failed, right? Any prediction that was based on this hypothesis, which was our hypothesis at a preposition specific level, was not confirmed. Meanwhile, our hypotheses at the verb specific level, so for the verbs zoeken and verlangen, were confirmed. And that makes sense, right? I mean, when each verb, when each alternating verb uses the alternation to express their own idiosyncratic meaning distinction, well, then that inevitably goes at the cost of any more general distinction at any more schematic level, right? So basically, if we apply the lexical origin mechanism at the proper level of thematicity, which for our case study, happens to be the verb specific level, it appears at least so, then we can make successful predictions. So basically, if we do that, then we can avoid Charybdis. Then as for Scylla, as for the problem of parsimony, can we claim to be parsimonious? Well, if we're talking about parsimony as parsimony of theoretical explanation, so the idea that you should keep your theoretical explanation as parsimonious as possible, with fewest theoretical assumptions as possible, then I'd say yes. Then yes, we can claim parsimony because the verb-specific meaning distinctions that we propose and that we find can be explained by an existing theoretical mechanism. That existing theoretical mechanism just needs to be applied at a proper level of schematicity. So that was our challenge. How do you hypothesize semantic distinctions that are specific enough to yield clearly falsifiable and successful predictions regarding language variation, while only relying on general theoretical mechanisms? Well, we can do that by incorporating the multi-level nature of the constructor into hypothesis testing. And we do that by sketching out the various possible levels of schematicity for the case study that we happen to be working on. And then applying the same theoretical mechanism at various levels. For instance, the lexical origin mechanism, basically any mechanism that you're working with can work, right? And finally, that allows you to systematically formulate and test hypotheses at various levels of schematicity. All right, so thank you for listening. If you're interested in the work that I just presented, here are the references. So this is a paper that's forthcoming in cognitive linguistics, but if you're interested, just send me an email at dirk.pijpops@uliège.be. So here's my email address, and I'll happily send you the preprint. It shouldn't take too long before it gets published, but I just sent in the proofs last week. So, might still take a couple of weeks or months. But you can also take a look at my PhD thesis, for which a reference you can see here. And again, I'll be happy to send you the full text if you just send me an email. All right, so also big thank you to these fine gentlemen here, Dirk Speelman, Freek van der Velde, and Stefan Grondelaars, as well as to Timothy Colleman, Florent Perek, William Croft, Evi van Treepjes, Heerlen. Of course, the organizers of these great series of talks and many others who all provided input to the work that I just presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this great presentation. Now we will start the discussion session with discussant Remy van Triep, head of the Language Research Unit at the SUNY Computer Science Laboratories, Paris. Thanks, Remy.
Hi, thank you for giving me this role, and I want to thank Dirk for this great talk, as always. Just before I start asking my questions, because what I love about this talk is that it gives me a lot of questions, is a thank you to the organizers, to the Association of Brazilian Linguistics for a great series, and not just giving a platform to the names that we all know, but also to young people like Dirk, who clearly deserves it. And then, Dirk, a small anecdote that might be interesting for the viewers of the stream, and maybe people who look at it later on YouTube. I read about this work already, I don't know how many years ago, when I was a reviewer of the paper, and I didn't know it was you who wrote it. I accidentally learned about this when I talked about it to Freek van der Velde later on. I said, I read this really great paper. I reviewed it. It should appear very soon. And then it only appears soon, a couple of years later, right? So what I want to say is that innovative work sometimes can take years before it gets accepted, but you have to persist, and you clearly persisted. What I really love about this talk is taking into account these multiple levels of the Constructional, because there's a lot of ideas in construction grammar and cognitive linguistics, but then when you look at the actual case studies, often some of these ideas are not reflected. And taking into account these multiple levels, and here I get to my first questions. So one question that I remember you put in the paper yourself is, of course, the big discussion between Lexicalist and constructional accounts of argument structure. So if you have case studies like these where you see often that it's verb specific, isn't it then more simple to just assume that the Lexicalist approach is right? And so what is the added value of these argument structure constructions? Do we have proof or evidence that that level of schematicity is useful for making predictions.
All right, yeah, thank you, Remy. Also, thank you for your very kind words, and for the yeah, for the anecdote, which is, I mean, the reason this took so long is not just because of the reviewers, but also because of myself. I have to say, it just took me a long time to resubmit the paper after after the various rounds of reviews. All right, so as for your questions, should we just stick with the verb specific approach, right? Yeah, I don't think so. So you could interpret my results, sorry. You could interpret my results in this way, right? The fact that the verb specific approach, so the lexicalist approach to argument structure is the right one. However, I think that the proper level of schematicity for it, I think the proper level of schematicity, or the proper level to investigate an argument structure alternation, differs from case to case. And for instance, say for the verb zoeken, which I talked about, I think that at least partially it functions at an even lower level. And that's the reason why some of the predictions of the looking for hypothesis were not confirmed. The fact that for, say, zoeken, zoek naar woord, zoek naar vorm, so for specific themes, they seem to be associated with their own meaning distinction. So they seem to have emerged as construction in their own right. And for other case studies, so for instance, for the dative alternation, I do think it makes more sense to use more schematic constructions rather than verb specific constructions. Perhaps not fully schematic constructions, but say something like verb class specific constructions, which are already more schematic. And that's also what you would expect based on usage-based theory, actually, that these various levels of abstraction all play a part, but play more of a role in differing from one case study to another, because the idea of one of the central ideas behind usage-based linguistics is that language variation accounts for a need of the language user. They use language variation to do something, right? And in our case, they would use argument structure variation to express differences in meaning. But it may differ from case to case at what level of schematicity it is most useful to express this meaning distinction. So for instance, for the Dutch psych verbs, right? So these are verbs such as ergeren, amuseren, irriteren, interesseren, etc. So annoy, irritate, interest, etc. They also occur in an argument structure variation, namely the variation between John ergert Elizabeth versus Elizabeth ergert zich aan John. Here you see that these verbs do seem to express more or less the same meaning distinction, and that's the meaning distinction in terms of agentivity. Basically, whether the stimulus, so the one from which which is causing the annoyance or which is causing the interest, is more or less agentive in reference to the experiencer, the ones who is experiencing the annoyance or the interest. So basically, I think no, I don't think we should go for a verb-specific approach, but I don't think we should go for a purely lexicalist approach. But I don't think we should go for a purely phrasal approach either, a purely schematic approach to argument structure. I think we need all of these levels. And the question, which level is most dominant, which level takes precedence, you could say, should be treated as an empirical question, as not as something that's fixed by theory.
Right, and I agree with that stance. There is a related question I have, which is about psychological plausibility. because the network approach with the schematicity is, of course, very useful from a theoretical point of view. But then the question is, how real is that? Because it might be useful for linguists to explain stuff, but is that real? Because there are usage-based models that are more radical, like exemplar-based models, memory-based models, that do not have these schematic abstractions, or only family-based abstractions, if at all, that are, at least for several computational tasks, are quite successful, and they might have some point in what do people actually make these schematic abstractions. Does the data, because I agree, it's an empirical question, does the data give you some kind of insight into whether such a model could make the right predictions or not?
Yeah, good question. So so basically my approach to the question, all right, is all of this cognitively plausible, is to say, I'll try to go to the slides again. All right, just a minute. So let's take the slide with our network. All right, there we have it. Share screen one. All right. All right, so here we have the slide with our network, right? Oh, God damn it, now I lost it. Okay. So here we have this network with all these different levels. I do not think this as a network is cognitively plausible. The fact that language users distinguish all of these levels. What this is basically is a potential network, right? With several potential levels of abstraction. The question is then, which are more cognitively plausible, are the ones basically where we can confirm that the same meaning distinction is at play for all of their instances. For instance, I think that this one here, the verb specific level of the verlangnach construction, that's fairly cognitively plausible. The fact that, so that's just the idea that language users associate verlangnach, so desire to, with the meaning longing for. I think that, for instance, this level here, verlangnach wordt, is also cognitively plausible because it also seems to be associated with their own specific meaning. Now, can we immediately conclude from purely corpus research that this is the case, that these are cognitively real? No, but we can basically identify the levels, the constructions, which are, if not cognitively real, then at least cognitively plausible. And then from there on, we can go on with other studies that can either confirm or reject that these are cognitively real. But I think the moment when language users start associating, say, a particular verb or a particular verb-theme combination with a meaning, that's the moment where we can say, all right, this construction here, this level is actually cognitively plausible. If that kind of answers.
Yes, that answers my question. And there was a very good question in the chat. So constructions, construction grammarians always talk about constructions all the way down, meaning that you would also have more discourse constructions. And so one question from the chat is, how do you deal with causality, for example, if you have a because construction? You might ask a question, then the answer is because something. Do you have an idea about how to investigate the argument structure of causality in this framework?
The argument structure of causality. So I was, yeah, okay. I was just looking at argument structure of verbs, right? But in principle, the same could be applied to argument structures of other words, such as, or the same could be applied not just to argument structure, but to basically any kind of construction or any kind of alternation. The idea there would be that, okay, let's start from a because construction. And let's start with a bunch of concrete instances of that because construction, right? So just sentences where because appears. And from there on, let's try to sketch a potential constructional network. Just the same network as the one that we saw here, but then with because constructions instead of with nav constructions, basically. Let's also try to sketch various levels of schematicity. And then let's just take one level, apply a theoretical algorithm or the theoretical mechanism to it, and formulate predictions. And let's do the same at the other level and at the other level. And in that way, I think that was kind of the main point of my talk. In that way, by doing so, by applying it to various levels, whatever that level might be is dependent on your case study, we can strongly increase the amount that our theory can explain. In this case, our usage-based theory can explain. So I'm not sure whether that completely answers your question. I mean, yes, because some constructions are harder to pin down than others. But yeah, that's pretty much dependent on your case study, right? And I think starting from individual instances is probably a good idea there.
Right, and if I may add, we are actually working on causal frames in our lab, and we started actually with Brussels in Brussels at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels with Katrien Beuls, Paul van Eke. They developed a construction grammar model for causal frame extraction for English, and I have a colleague now who does that for Italian. So to answer the question, as Dirk mentioned, you have, I would call them frame triggering or frame evoking lexical items like the word because. These may trigger these constructions that are more abstract, that a slot of a construction can be filled by a very complex filler, like the complete construct that came before can be the filler of a discourse construction. And so that is how in a construction grammar approach you can try to investigate the argument structure of causality. We can perhaps move on to a more theoretical question, if you permit me to play the devil's advocate for a minute. You say that parsimony, this approach is more parsimonious than, for example, a language acquisition device, which depends on your perspective, because you might say the language acquisition device is something that biologists have to explain. And so we can just take it for granted, and our explanation is actually simple. Whereas if you have the usage-based cognitive approach, you have to explain still how these general cognitive mechanisms get recruited for, which ultimately is a human-specific capacity, human language. So so first, very quick, isn't actually the predictions, which predictions it makes, more important than whether the theory is parsimonious? And second, related to that, what is actually the role of prediction to you in linguistics? Why is it important?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Okay, so so to answer the first part, basically, just saying, for instance, explaining the emergence of a language acquisition device, that's the job for biologists. Yeah, I think that's cheating. I mean, that's just, we have something here. We need it to make our theory work, but we can't explain it. So you do it. Go away. I think as linguists, we shouldn't just be linguists. We should be scientists, right? And that means that our job is to explain explain what we see, explain the facts, and not just keeping within our little discipline, and just limiting ourselves to what we can do within that discipline. So in a way, any linguist would have to be interdisciplinary, because every scientist is interdisciplinary. And as for the second part, so there the question, hang on, remind me again. So there the question was, okay, what's the role of prediction versus parsimony, right? Which one is
the
more
role of
important?
prediction? Yeah, from the point of view, like what kind of science is linguistics, which is a big question, right? The idea of prediction is something that, as to my knowledge, only entered linguistics as a field with Chomsky, who took more or less theoretical physics as a model where you have your theory, you make predictions, and then you see whether your predictions hold true. And the question is is that a good model for linguistics? Yes or no? And what is then the role of prediction, or why? What does it teach us about the language capacity?
Yeah, okay. Okay, I see your question. No, I wouldn't. I mean, the way I see the concept of prediction is it's not strictly limited to, for instance, these predictions that you have in physics. And I also don't think that, at least I mean, that's a very specific meaning of what predictions. I see it as a more general thing, and that also was part of linguistics since it began, basically. I mean, the Indo-Europeanists were also making predictions, right? They were saying, all right, if this sound change happened in this stage of Indo-European or any other language that we're trying to reconstruct, then we should see this and this and this, and then that's something that's a prediction that you can test. Or for instance, you have, I think de Saussure made a famous prediction about a certain sound that should have been part of Indo-European at some point, but is no longer present in any European language. But that was a prediction that he made based just on how sounds evolve, basically. And then that prediction was confirmed when people discovered Hittite. People discovered that Hittite was an Indo-European language and still had that sound. So that's, for instance, another prediction that linguists were making before Chomsky. Basically, the way that I use prediction is in a more general sense, and in a sense that I think other sciences, such as biology, which I agree would be the proper, or at least perhaps not the proper, but more of a better candidate for linguistics to model itself on, where they also basically make predictions about how based on evolution, how species would evolve. So basically, how I see the relation between both is to say, all right, let's look at the empirical facts, to the observations that we make, and let's make sure that we can explain those right. That means predict those right. And usually you'll find out that there are multiple explanations for that. And then as a second step, you should go for the explanation that's most parsimonious. And usually you don't need that much. You don't need that much theory to explain the observations. That's also something that you see in agent-based models, right? Something that you're also very familiar with. The fact that if you implement just the slightest, say effect or mechanism in how people process language, that can already lead to massive language changes and can create very intricate tendencies in language use. Yeah, so I don't know.
I fully agree that biology is a much better model for linguistics, so closely related, because what I like about the paper that you presented a lot, and I think that this is what linguists have to do constantly, is this back and forth between the theory and then the data, right? So you have your theoretical framework, then you go and you test, what are my top 5, words that appear in this construction? Can we then extract this, and then can we make predictions? So you constantly have to work out the details. Now, how difficult is it in this kind of work to rule out other kinds of factors? But because in between the time that you started this research and now there has been a lot of work, for example, on statistical preemption, with a famous example, Explain Me This by Adele Goldberg. Explain in English at least is one of these verbs that seems to resist occurring in a ditransitive construction. I know in Dutch for us this is perfectly normal, but in English it sounds a bit weird. They would prefer explain this to me. And one possible explanation for that is statistical preemption, is that there's some kind of preference that children acquire, which preempts the verb from occurring in this kind of construction, even though from a semantic coherence point of view, it would make perfect sense. So if you would take your vector approach, you would expect the vectors to be very close to each other, and so how do you account for those interfering forces, I would say?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, indeed. But what you say is totally right. That would be very hard to explain from a purely based on say the lexical origin mechanism. Now this mechanism of statistical preemption kind of works on a different but that's basically capable of explaining why children use the construction or acquire the construction, right? Or how children learn that they shouldn't say explain me that. What that cannot yet explain is how the tendency emerged in language usage at some point, right? I mean, okay, you can explain how do children learn that they shouldn't do it, and that you use statistical preemption for that, but for that to work, there first needs to be a tendency in language usage where explain me that isn't used for some reason, right? So that's basically the distinction between the explaining how constructions emerge at the individual level with language acquisition versus explaining how they emerge or how meaning emerge at the community level. Now, basically, to answer your question, how could you explain that some verbs such as explain do not seem to appear in the ditransitive construction? At a population level, right? We can explain why they don't do that at an individual level using statistical preemption. How do we do that at a population level? I don't know. I don't know yet. That's, I think, something we still need to figure out. Meaning, like you say, doesn't seem to be able, or at least I don't see yet how meaning is able to explain that. For that, you will need to conduct a diachronic study, I guess. A diachronic study into the to see how the ditransitive construction evolved and emerged in English, which is actually something that one of our colleagues from the University of Zurich, Eva Zedener, is currently working on and has already done a lot of work on. So I think she's probably the best person to ask that question, because I don't know.
Right. Another, maybe perhaps you cannot answer the question, but another question I have is concerning the meaning and how you hypothesize meaning, because there is what I'm trying to get at is, in construction grammar, we always say that constructions are meaning form mappings, a bit like lexical items. But obviously, language is an inferential system where the meaning is not completely in the message. A lot of the meaning comes from the actual language user who has to interpret the meaning into a real situation. And so you could say that constructions are more like the stable parts of the meaning that help to facilitate this process. Now, if you have an example which is as fine-grained as the chip, at, or slap example, how do you decide that this is some part of the constructional meaning or not? Because you might say that some part of the interpretation, or some part, at least big part of the meaning, might come at the fact that we are interpreters, that we know a bit from the world. We know that chipping, what kind of movement that is. Is it necessarily entrenched into our linguistic representations?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. Let's go back to that that example here. Now, let me share my screen again. Okay. Right, so let's take this chip at meaning, right? So the fact that it happened repeatedly or in a bit by bit fashion. And then the question is, all right, how do we know whether this repeatedly or in a bit by bit fashion here, laser pointer, repeatedly or in a bit by bit fashion, how do we know that that's really part of the constructional meaning and that's not just interpreted or in interpreted by the language user at that in that context, right? That's the question, right? Yeah. Okay. So I think the best way to test that is basically, all right, let's start from this sentence, which has this meaning. Now let's remove the at construction from it and replace it by another construction. For instance, replace it by the transitive construction, and then we end up with this sentence. And here we see that that meaning element is no longer present. Now, you can say, all right, is that because that the meaning element was directly associated with the construction, or is that because language users interpret it in a different way? Well, that doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned. What we basically see is that, all right, if this construction is not present, then that meaning element is also not present. And so that means that language users have to know in some way that once at is present with this particular verb, with this verb chip, for instance, the meaning is repeatedly or in a bit by bit fashion. Or to use an example from my actual case study, let's see. I had some examples here, right? Creativiteit. Ja, say Dirk de Wilde verlangt tot meer creativiteit versus Dirk de Wilde verlangt naar wat meer creativiteit, right? The variant with the transitive construction expresses a demand. That was our hypothesis, which was confirmed, right? Versus the variant with the prepositional variant expresses more of a longing. You see that here. At least that's, I think, more or less clear for language users. If a language user interprets this first sentence as entailing a demand, whereas they interpret the second sentence as entailing a longing for, then it has to be the case that they know that when the verb verlang is combined with naar, that means a longing for, or at least they should interpret that as being a longing for, versus when the verb verlangen is not combined with an naar, but rather used transitively, they should interpret that as a demand. So basically what I'm saying is, all right, they have to know that in some way. So it has to be cognitively real in some way. And that's enough for me. And whether you can then say, all right, is it associated with that meaning, or is it a common interpretation that they have to do each time? Well, it doesn't really matter for me. That the fact is that they have to know that verlang naar, they should interpret it as longing for, and they also have to know that transitive verlangen, they should interpret it as demanding. Does that kind of?
Yes. I think that's very pragmatic. If I can ask you one more last question. You've talked a lot about the vertical relations in the network today and the schematicity, but I sense that this methodology of that you use is also very relevant for identifying the horizontal relations between different argument structure constructions. A bit like almost paradigmatic oppositions between them. Am I completely off track here, or is that something you can see working?
Yeah. I mean, no, you're not completely off track. That is something that I see working. I'm still trying to figure out what these horizontal relations would be. So it's kind of tempting to say, all right, there's a horizontal relation between, say, the transitive verlang naar construction and the prepositional verlang naar construction, right? And that wouldn't be so crazy because they both have the verb verlangen in there. So it's quite obvious that language users, I mean, it's not that far-fetched that language users associate two constructions with each other. So then the question would be, all right, I mean, you could frame basically the same question as a question of, all right, which horizontal relations are present, right? Is there a horizontal relation between, say, a schematic naar construction and a schematic transitive construction? Would that be an allostruction, for instance? Or would that be two allostructions that are associated with one another? Or is it at a lower level? And is there a horizontal relation between transitive zoek constructions, transitive zoek naar construction, etc.? And then you can use the same mechanism. So I think it's mostly a matter of how you want to present this question of to which level of schematicity is the most appropriate one. You can just say the way I did it, and then mostly talk about vertical links, or you can say, no, what we're actually interested is at which level of schematicity are these horizontal links most likely most cognitively plausible. So yeah, I think it's mostly a way of just presenting the same work.
Right, Dirk, thank you. I personally don't have any other questions. I really enjoyed your talk and all of your answers.
Thank you. It's really nice.
Well, thank you very much, Dirk and Remy, for your collaboration with the series Abdaling ao Vivo. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to continue watching our live lectures. Dirk, would you like to say something before we end the transmission?
Yeah, sure. Again, big thank you to the organizers. Big thank you to you, Miguel, but also to all other people of Abralin, not just for inviting me, but for also organizing all of these talks. Also, big thank you to Remy, of course, for agreeing to be part of this and to to ask me these great questions. I mean, Remy knows that I really enjoy these types of discussions. That's kind of what drives me. That's kind of why I love being a linguist and why I love my job, to have these discussions. Yeah, also big thank you to basically everyone that I mentioned at, I won't share my slides again, but at the end of my slides. So big thank you to Freek van der Velde, Dirk Speelman, Stefan Grondelaars, Timothy Colleman, Flora Perek, William Croft, Chris Hale, and many others, which all helped me and which all, without whom I wouldn't be able to do this kind of research. Thanks. And also a big thank you to all the viewers, of course, that were here with us today.
Thank you, Dirk, once again. Thanks, everyone. Until next time.